Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for May the 18th, 2021. Hope you're doing well this day. So our text for today, we've got Numbers 27, Isaiah 17 and 18, Psalms 70 and 71, and then 1 Peter chapter 5. So let's launch right in. We'll start with the book of Numbers, Numbers 27. So if you remember Numbers 26, we had that second census in the book of Numbers, which starts the second section in the book of Numbers, really, where the whole entire book of Numbers is framed by those two censuses. And really after that second census, everything is now preparing the way for the entrance into the promised land. For the Hebrew people, they are moving into this stage of now anticipating the final fulfillment of God's promises to them of this land flowing with milk and honey. And so we are seeing that process here. We're going to get a few more laws that come into play here as well. But we also have in Numbers 27 something of that transition to this new stage in the life of the people of Israel. So the first thing that is dealt with here is the law of inheritance. So a question had come up: what happens when the father passes away and there's no sons to inherit the property? And this, of course, this is significant because they're about to be coming into property. So what's the solution here? And Moses brings this before the Lord, and the Lord proclaims that the property can go to the daughters. So these particular daughters in this text had come before Moses with a specific issue, and he brought it before the Lord, and it is the daughters that can keep that land within the family of the father. And so a interesting legal decision here. I think that says something about the value of the land, but also the significance of land within the family, and the promises of God within the family of the individual Jewish people. But at the end of this chapter, of course, we have the first hints here of a transition with Moses and Joshua. And we'll see this, of course, later on in the book of Deuteronomy, a more extensive transition and more extensive, I guess you could even call it an ordination of Joshua as the new leader of Israel going into the promised land to lead the conquest of the promised land. Here Moses goes up on the mountain as the Lord instructs him in verse 12 to look at the promised land, because he's not going to be able to go into the promised land. And then there's this commissioning of Joshua at the end of this account. And of course, there will be a fuller detailing of that commissioning later on. A very significant event for the Israelite people, of course, because this is a public commissioning that will take place. It's a public recognition of God's divine hand upon Joshua. So this is kind of pointing forward, I guess, to the more extensive treatment of that account later on in the book of Deuteronomy. Moving on to Psalms 70 and 71, we have two individual laments here again. So we have some more of these laments. You'll notice that Psalm 70, if you're reading through it, you may have a sense of deja vu here, because you will find this almost verbatim in Psalm 40, verses 13 through 17. And this is a psalm that's a little bit shorter. There's disagreement among scholars over what the relationship is between the two, but I don't think there's a particular issue here in our interpretation of it. What I appreciate, though, about Psalm 70 and 71, both being individual laments, is especially the psalmist's confidence in Psalm 71, and he does it in an interesting way, I think, to show his confidence in God throughout the totality of his life. You'll notice that in verse 6, for instance, he talks about how God has sustained him from his birth, took him from his mother's womb. My praise is continually of you. And so this leads him to request, do not cast me off in the time of old age, verse 9. Similarly, when you get down to verse 17, "O God, you have taught me from my youth, and I declared your wondrous deeds. And even when I'm old and gray, do not forsake me." And so there's this sense in which the psalmist is looking backward at God's faithfulness and looking forward to God's continued faithfulness to him, and his desire to for God to continue to protect him and to provide for him. And this will result, verse 14, in that the psalmist will continue to hope continually and to praise yet more and more. I love the sense of superlative there, right? You're doing it, you're hoping continually, not just every now and then. You're praising him more and more. So there's a superlative of time there. You're doing this continually, and there's a superlative of amount, right? You're doing it more and more. So interesting psalm. And again, when you read through these psalms, you'll various things will strike you as you read through them, and pay attention, especially to the psalmist's words and his figures of speech and the way he phrases things, and always ask that question: why does he say it the way he does? So that brings us to Isaiah 17 and 18. We're continuing our judgments against these foreign nations. Here we have a prophecy and a judgment oracle against Damascus, and also a message to Ethiopia, what is known as Cush here in the text. And these, the one against Damascus is, I think, particularly significant because it harkens back to some earlier texts in the book of Isaiah, which speak some judgment against the northern kingdom of Israel. So remember that at this point in time, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Israel are divided. So you have the northern 10 tribes and the southern tribe of Judah. This happened, of course, around 931 BC, which is about, almost 200 years before Isaiah is prophesying here. So they've been divided for a while. And at one point, the city of Damascus, which is the capital of Syria, or Aram is how it's sometimes referred to in the scriptures. Aram and the northern kingdom had cooperated together against the southern kingdom of Judah, and thus you'll see that there's this kind of intermixing between Damascus and the northern kingdom of Israel, even in this text, in terms of the judgment that they're going to receive. But I want to direct your attention to a phrase that is used in verse 7. In that day, man will have regard for his maker. In the day of judgment, there will be some who come to a realization of who God is and come back to God. And then he refers to him again as the Holy One of Israel in verse 7. And I think I've referred to this, how the prophecies that the prophetic call narratives of these major prophets, like with Jeremiah and Ezekiel and here with Isaiah, imprint themselves in the mind of the author. So Isaiah, when he sees God on his throne in Isaiah 6, sees him primarily for his holiness, because of course this is what the seraphim are crying out: holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. And as you read through the book of Isaiah, what you will find is that over and over and over again, Isaiah will be referring to God as that Holy One of Israel, more than all the other prophets put together. And it's really a stark number to compare the references to God as holy or as the Holy One of Israel. This becomes the defining characteristic of God to Isaiah. And of course, holiness here refers not just to moral purity, but to his complete separation and dedication to himself, which is something we see in this all throughout the book of Isaiah, is that God is portrayed with this excellence, right? In fact, I've heard holiness described before as this: that when you run out of superlatives to describe God, you describe him as holy. I think that's a good way of looking at it. His holy otherness from everything that is created. That brings us to 1 Peter chapter 5. In 1 Peter 5, we have an exhortation to the elders in the church to continue to shepherd the flock. This is, of course, fulfilled primarily, I think, with the pastoral role today. So this is something that pastors should pay attention to, these kind of exhortations. You'll find similar exhortations of Paul to pastor figures in Timothy and Titus, First Timothy and the book of Titus. But here we have that exhortation to shepherd the flock. I think that's an excellent way of describing the pastoral role, is not just as someone who exhorts and proclaims the Bible, but there's this shepherding role as well. And it's to be done with humility. Then in verse 5, you have the exhortation to the younger men within the church to subject themselves to the elders. And then I love this. It's a very stark image here, to clothe yourself with humility. So you think about, get up in the morning, we'd put on our outfits. I put on my sweater vest, and that becomes kind of part of us. It's the most visible aspect of who we are, right? It's our clothing. It kind of even defines who we are. So some people will wear certain things because they want to portray a certain image. Well, the image and the most visible outward display of who we are as believers in Christ should be this sense of humility towards one another. And then in verse 6, he says, humble yourself. Excuse me. In this exhortation, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in the proper time. And then you have, I love the way the New American Standard here translates this, casting all your anxiety on him. I think this is a really interesting way of phrasing this, because oftentimes you'll see that that verb for casting as an imperative. So some translations will say, humble yourselves, and then cast all your anxiety on him. But these two things are actually related to each other. Humble yourselves, and then you have to think about, well, how is casting your anxiety related to humility? Well, it's a demonstration, isn't it, of our humility. We humble ourselves by casting our anxiety on him, by holding our cares to ourselves, by trying to handle our cares ourselves. We are not showing humility, are we? But humility says, I can't do this on my own. Therefore, I'm going to cast it upon God, who is the one who can control and handle these situations that I find myself in, including, by the way, I think the suffering that this early church had been going through. So this is a really, I think, an interesting and neat way of seeing what humility actually is in the life of a believer. And then finally, you have this exhortation famous exhortation to be on the alert, resisting the devil, because he, as an adversary, is the one who prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. There is a reality, isn't there, of spiritual warfare, and there is the reality of the demonic. And yet there is also the reality that he can be resisted, even as James talks about in James 4, that we looked at a few days ago, actually. But we resist him. And how do we resist him? By being firm in your faith and knowing that the same experiences you are suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. So you're firm in your faith, and you also are realizing that you're not in this alone. That's kind of what Peter is saying here. That's how you ultimately resist the attacks of the devil that you might have, and specifically that the attacks of suffering and persecution that this early church was undergoing. So some great exhortations towards humility and towards perseverance and spiritual warfare here in this last chapter of the book of First Peter. It's a good way to end our time together today on this day, May the 18th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.